There is a man in every room you have ever walked into. You didn't always notice him. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the most decorated. He wasn't standing on a table demanding attention. He was sitting quietly in the corner, watching, calculating. And by the time you walked out of that room, he had already decided what role you would play in his story. He is the puppet master. And here's what's going to disturb you deeply. He may already be in your life, in your office, in your circle of friends, perhaps even in your mirror. Today, we go inside one of the most dangerous, most misunderstood, and most psychologically complex personality traits ever documented: Machiavellianism. We will learn what it is, how it works, why it spreads, and most critically, what you can do when you encounter it. Stay with me. This is one of the most important psychological journeys you will ever take. To understand Machiavellianism, you first need to understand the man whose name it bears, and more importantly, the world that created him. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence, Italy, in 1469. He was not a villain. He was not a monster in a cape twirling evil plans. He was, in fact, a deeply thoughtful political philosopher, a diplomat, and a civil servant who loved his city. But Florence in the late 15th century was not a fairy tale. It was a battlefield of shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, family-driven assassinations, and absolute power concentrated in the hands of very few men. The Medici family rose and fell. Republics were born and strangled overnight. Men were exiled for loyalty and rewarded for treachery. Machiavelli watched all of this. He participated in it. He was eventually imprisoned, tortured, and exiled from the very city he served. And in that exile, stripped of position and power, he did what brilliant minds do when the world breaks them. He wrote. His most famous work, The Prince, gave us the cold logic of power. But it is in the Discourses on Livy, his deeper, more nuanced work, that we find the true complexity of his thinking. Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Discourses is not about a single powerful ruler. It is about something far more profound. The necessary tension between those who seek to dominate and those who resist being dominated. Machiavelli observed that in the Roman Republic, the conflict between the Senate and the common people, the patricians and the plebeians, was not merely destructive. It was, in fact, the engine of Roman greatness. He argued that discord, rivalry, and the clash of opposing forces could actually produce the laws and structures that keep a society free. Think about that for a moment. The struggle between the controller and the controlled, between the puppet master and the marionette, is not just a dark corner of human nature. It is, according to Machiavelli, a fundamental and even generative force in human civilization. That is what makes this so fascinating and so dangerous. In modern psychology, Machiavellianism is one of three personality traits grouped together as the dark triad, identified by psychologists Paulhus and Williams in 2002. A Machiavellian individual is characterized by 1. A strategic, calculating approach to social situations. 2. A willingness to deceive and manipulate to achieve goals. 3. A focus on self-interest above emotional connection. 4. A cynical view of human nature, believing that most people are weak, gullible, and easily led. And here's the terrifying part. Research shows that Machiavellian traits exist spectrum. Most of us sit somewhere between 0 and high Machiavellian. But those at the extreme end, they see every room as a chessboard. And you're just another piece. Let's go directly to the source. In Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Discourses, Machiavelli makes a claim that shocked his contemporaries and still echoes with startling relevance today. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that the tumults between the Senate and the people of Rome, which many historians condemned as the source of Rome's troubles, were actually the primary cause of Rome's freedom. Let that sink in. The fights, the protests, the power struggles, the constant friction between those holding power and those subject to it. Machiavelli said this was not Rome's weakness. It was Rome's strength. Why? Because that ongoing tension forced accountability. It created laws. It kept any single group from seizing total, unchecked control. Now, what does this have to do with Machiavellianism as a personality trait? Everything. Because the puppet master, the Machiavellian individual in your life, understands something that most people don't. They understand that power is not given. It is taken. And it is maintained through the deliberate management of conflict and tension. Let me give you a modern example. Imagine a mid-level manager at a company. Let's call him David. David is not the CEO. He's not the highest paid person in the room. But somehow, every major decision flows through David. Information passes through him. Conflicts get resolved on his terms. Promotions happen because David approved of them, even if nobody ever gave him that authority formally. How did David get here? He studied chapter 4. Not literally, but instinctively. David understood that if he could position himself as the interpreter between upper management and the employees beneath him, he would become indispensable. He created just enough tension between groups to make everyone feel they needed him. He shared carefully selected pieces of information upward while filtering what flowed downward. He built loyalty by doing small favors and then collected those favors at precisely the right moments. David is not evil in a comic book sense, but David is a Machiavellian. And the people around David are in varying degrees, his puppets, most of them completely unaware. Machiavelli's insight in the Discourses was that this kind of tension management is not exceptional. It is the natural state of organized human life. Wherever there is a hierarchy, a family, a school, a company, a government, a friend group, there is the potential for a puppet master to emerge. The question Machiavelli was really asking, and the question we need to ask today, is this: is the tension between the controller and the controlled something we should eliminate, or something we should understand and channel? His answer was nuanced. He believed that when people are aware of power dynamics and actively resist unchecked control, the result is freedom and growth. But when people are passive, ignorant of the game being played around them, they become the puppets. This is, perhaps, the most important message this video will deliver. Awareness is the only antidote to manipulation. Let's get deep into the psychology now. What actually goes on inside the mind of a high Machiavellian individual? Research from psychologists Richard Christie and Florence Geis, who first developed the Machiavelli scale to measure Machiavellian traits in 1970, revealed a fascinating cognitive pattern. High Macs, as they're called, don't experience the world the way most people do. While the average person enters a social situation thinking about connection. How am I coming across? Do they like me? Am I being kind? The high Mac enters thinking about architecture. They're asking, who has the power here? What does each person want? What information is valuable? Where is the weakness? How do I position myself to benefit from this situation? This is not a conscious, effortful process for them. It is their default operating mode. Like how a musician walks into a room and automatically hears the acoustics, the high Mac walks in and automatically maps the power dynamics. Here are the 6 core psychological tools of the puppet master. Selective information control. The puppet master never gives you the full picture, not because they don't have it, but because information is currency, and they spend it with extreme precision. They will tell you what keeps you engaged, what keeps you loyal, and what keeps you slightly insecure enough to need them. Think about a friend who always seems to know everything about everyone in your social group, but you notice that each person in the group has a slightly different version of events. That's not gossip. That's architecture. The puppet master is the hub through which all information flows, and they are editing it in real time. Strategic empathy without emotional investment. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Machiavellianism. High Macs are often extraordinarily good at reading emotions. They can tell when you're sad, when you're insecure, when you're ambitious, when you're afraid. But unlike empathetic individuals who feel with you, the high Mac uses this emotional intelligence as a targeting system. They see your vulnerability not as something to heal, but as a lever to pull. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that high Mac individuals score high on cognitive empathy, understanding what you feel, but low on effective empathy sharing in what you feel. They are, in essence, emotional tacticians. Tool 3. Long game thinking. Most people react to the immediate moment. The puppet master is playing a game that takes months or years to complete. They will absorb short-term losses, being overlooked, being criticized, even being humiliated, because they know these are merely early moves in a longer sequence. This directly echoes Machiavelli's chapter 4 insight. The tension between opposing forces plays out over time. The puppet master is patient in ways that most people simply cannot sustain. Imagine a chess player who deliberately loses 3 pawns in the opening so they can control the center of the board by move 15. Most opponents celebrate taking those pawns. The master smiles and waits. Coalition building and triangulation. The puppet master rarely acts alone. They build networks of people who each believe they have a special relationship with the puppet master, but who don't fully know each other's role. In a workplace, this might look like building separate close alliances with the HR director, the IT lead, and 2 department heads, while ensuring none of them compare notes. Each person feels like a confidant. None of them realizes they are nodes in a network with one person at the center. Machiavelli called this the management of factions. In chapter 4, he observed that Rome's strength came from groups competing for influence, but what the puppet master does is subtly manage those factions so that the competition always benefits them. Tool 5. The favor economy. Machiavellians are obsessive favor traders. They track social debts with the precision of an accountant. Every act of help, every gesture of generosity, every small sacrifice, these are investments, not gifts. When it's time to collect, the collection is swift and the expectation is non-negotiable. And they time the collection brilliantly always when you are most grateful, least suspicious, and most likely to comply. The psychological principle at work here is Robert Cialdini's law of reciprocity. Humans are hardwired to repay favors. The puppet master weaponizes this instinct. Tool 6. Controlled vulnerability. This one surprises most people. The puppet master will occasionally deliberately show you a moment of apparent weakness. They'll confide something personal. They'll admit a small failure. They'll express doubt or uncertainty in a carefully calibrated way. This makes you trust them. It makes you lower your guard. It makes you feel that the power dynamic between you is more equal than it actually is. Psychologists call this strategic self-disclosure. It creates intimacy on demand while the high Mac remains fully in control of the narrative they're sharing with you. Now here's where it gets genuinely motivational and where Machiavelli himself becomes our guide against the very forces he described. Because Machiavelli, for all his reputation as the philosopher of cold power, was not a mindless advocate for manipulation. In the Discourses, he is actually far more democratic and freedom-oriented than most people realize. In Book 1, Chapter 4, his central argument is that the people, the common mass, are not merely passive recipients of power. They are, in fact, the ultimate check on any puppet master. He writes that it was the voice of the people, their resistance, their willingness to push back against the Senate's control, that kept Rome free. This is Machiavelli's gift to us, a roadmap not just for how the puppet master operates, but for how ordinary people defeat them. History gives us vivid examples of the puppet master's limits. Consider the story of Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France in the early 17th century. Richelieu was one of history's most documented real-world Machiavellians, a man who controlled the French king, managed court factions, played Catholic and Protestant forces against each other across Europe, and centralized power in ways that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. And for years, it worked brilliantly. Richelieu was untouchable. But here is what happened. The very factions he had played against each other eventually began to compare notes. The people he had individually convinced that they had his special confidence began, slowly, to see the larger pattern. And by the time he died in 1642, France was exhausted, resentful, and on the edge of the civil upheaval that would eventually lead to revolution. The puppet master's greatest weakness is the very thing that makes them powerful, their need to be at the center of everything. Psychologically, this manifests in a predictable collapse pattern. When the Machiavellian individual overextends, when they manage too many factions, when the web of deceptions becomes too complex, when someone in the system gains enough information to see the whole picture, the entire structure collapses rapidly. This is sometimes called the trust cascade. Once one person publicly names what the puppet master has been doing, others begin to connect their own experiences. The individual threads of manipulation become visible as a unified web. And the web, once seen, cannot be unseen. In corporate settings, this is why Machiavellian leaders who rise quickly often fall catastrophically. A 2019 study in the Leadership Quarterly found that while high Mac leaders initially achieve rapid advancement, they are significantly more likely to experience dramatic career failures, interpersonal betrayals, and institutional ejections than their peers. The strings, eventually, wrap around their own hands. Machiavelli's lesson from Chapter 4 remains timeless. The tension between power and the people who resist power is self-correcting if the people are awake. If they understand the game being played. If they choose, collectively, to name what they see. This is not just political theory. This is the psychology of every relationship, every office, every family, every community. The puppet master thrives in silence and confusion. They dissolve in clarity and collective awareness. This is where we turn the lens inward. And I want you to be truly honest with yourself as we go through this section, because it is simultaneously the most uncomfortable and the most liberating part of this conversation. The question is not just, is there a puppet master in my life? The equally important question is, am I, in any dimension, a puppet master myself? Because here is the psychological truth. Machiavellian behaviors exist on a spectrum, and virtually all of us have engaged in some version of them. You have withheld information strategically. You have built alliances. You have done a favor knowing you might want one back someday. You have shown selective vulnerability to build trust. The difference between a healthy strategist and a destructive Machiavellian lies not in the presence of these behaviors, but in their intensity, their frequency, their underlying motivation, and critically, their disregard for the genuine well-being of others. Ask yourself these questions honestly. Question 1. In your relationships and professional life, do you generally aim for outcomes that benefit both you and others, or primarily just yourself, even at others' expense? Question 2. When you share personal information, is it because you genuinely trust the other person, or are you consciously managing what impression they'll have of you? Question 3. Do you enjoy situations where you have more information than the people around you, and do you use that informational advantage actively? Question 4. Do you find yourself looking at people and immediately categorizing them by their usefulness to your goals? Question 5. When a conflict arises between two people in your life, do you naturally look for what role you can play that protects your position even before you consider who is right or wrong? If you answered yes to most of these, especially with frequency and without discomfort, it's worth exploring your Machiavellian tendencies more deeply, perhaps with the support of a therapist or counselor. But here's the motivational message underneath this uncomfortable mirror. Machiavelli himself, in the Discourses, was not writing a manual for permanent manipulation. He was writing an analysis of power so that citizens could recognize and resist it. His deepest belief, as shown in Book 1, was that republics, built on the checks between competing groups, were superior to tyrannies. He believed in systems where no single puppet master could hold the strings forever. He believed in you, in the collective capacity of aware, engaged people to outmaneuver the manipulator. Understanding the puppet master's psychology is not about becoming one. It is about becoming immune to one. The psychologist Jordan Peterson has a relevant concept here. He argues that a person who understands the full darkness of human nature, who has genuinely confronted what they are capable of and what others are capable of, and who then chooses to act with integrity, is infinitely more trustworthy and powerful than someone who is merely innocent. Innocence is not virtue, it is just ignorance. Virtue is knowing the game and choosing not to play it in ways that harm others. That choice made consciously, made repeatedly, made even when it costs you something, that is the greatest form of psychological strength a human being can develop. Now we get practical. You've met the puppet master. You understand how they think. You've done the uncomfortable self-reflection. Now, how do you protect yourself? Here are 7 psychological defenses drawn from both Machiavelli's insights and modern psychological research. Cultivate deliberate awareness. The puppet master's greatest weapon is your unawareness. Their second greatest weapon is your emotional reactivity, because when you react without thinking, you are predictable, and predictability is controllable. Practice what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, thinking about your thinking. When you're in a situation that triggers a strong emotional response, pause. Ask, why am I feeling this? Who benefits from me feeling this way right now? This is not paranoia. This is clarity. Diversify your information sources. Never let a single person be your exclusive source of information about a situation, a group, or another person. The puppet master thrives by being the exclusive interpreter of reality for their targets. When you gather information from multiple, independent sources and compare them, you begin to see the architecture and the architect. In Rome, Machiavelli observed, it was when the plebeians began to organize and compare their experiences that the Senate's control was checked. Apply this to your own life. Name what you see directly and calmly. One of the most powerful things you can do when you suspect manipulation is simply name it, without drama, without accusation, but clearly. I've noticed that our conversations often result in me taking actions that benefit you. I'd like to understand that dynamic better. This is psychologically destabilizing for a high Mach individual because their entire strategy depends on operating in the shadows. Bringing the strategy into light calmly, non-aggressively removes the architecture of invisibility they depend on. Slow down the favor economy. When someone does something generous for you, resist the automatic impulse to immediately reciprocate out of social discomfort. Thank them genuinely. But take time before repaying, and when you do repay, repay proportionately, not excessively. The puppet master often counts on you repaying a small favor with a large one because you feel the discomfort of an outstanding social debt. Don't overpay your social debts, and don't take on debts you don't consciously choose. Defense 5. Protect your vulnerabilities intelligently. This does not mean becoming emotionally closed. Healthy intimacy requires genuine vulnerability. But it does mean being thoughtful about when and with whom you share your deepest insecurities, fears, and ambitions. A useful litmus test: has this person responded to your vulnerabilities in the past by offering genuine support, or by finding subtle ways to reference them back to you in moments of tension? The latter is a red flag. Build lateral connections. The puppet master positions themselves as the hub through which all connection flows. Counter this by building your own direct, independent relationships with people in your network relationships that don't pass through or require the puppet master. This is exactly what Machiavelli described in Chapter 4. The freedom of Rome depended on groups having their own voices, their own leaders, their own channels not being exclusively mediated by the Senate. When you have strong lateral connections, peers who know each other and know you, no single person can control the narrative about you. Know your own values so well that manipulation has no foothold. The deepest and most powerful defense against a puppet master is a deep, clear, non-negotiable knowledge of your own values. What do you stand for? What will you absolutely not do, regardless of social pressure, regardless of how the request is framed? Machiavellian manipulation works by finding the gray areas in people's characters, the places where they're willing to bend if the framing is right. A person who knows exactly where they stand and who has practiced saying no without extensive justification is extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Viktor Frankl, in his account of surviving Nazi concentration camps, described this principle in its most extreme form. Even in conditions of total external control, the person who has clear inner values retains a form of freedom that no puppet master can touch. Between stimulus and response, Frankl wrote, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, that pause, is where your freedom lives. Protect it. We are reaching the heart of this journey now, and I want to offer you a reframe that will, I believe, change how you see this entire topic. Machiavelli has been called the father of manipulation, the philosopher of evil, the man who taught tyrants how to rule. But in the Discourses, his honest, mature, most personal work, he reveals something entirely different. He reveals a man who was heartbroken. He watched Florence, the city he loved, fall repeatedly to tyrants. He saw republics dismantled by puppet masters who had no one to answer to. He saw what happened when people became complacent, when they stopped engaging with power, when they assumed someone else would protect their freedom. And he wrote with urgency, with passion, that the people, organized, aware, and resistant to unchecked control, are the greatest force in any political system. This is his true lesson. The puppet master can only exist in a population of people who don't know their puppets. The moment people understand the dynamics of power, the moment they begin to see the strings, those strings lose their hold. This is why education, why self-awareness, why open discourse, and the free exchange of information are not just nice academic values. They are, in the most literal sense, the mechanisms of human freedom. When you wake up to the psychological dynamics we've discussed today, you are not becoming cold or cynical or manipulative yourself. You are becoming free. Genuinely, deeply free in the way that Machiavelli, the true Machiavelli, always hoped his readers would become. The puppet master fears one thing above all others: a room full of people who see clearly, who speak openly, who have built strong, direct bonds with each other, who know their own values, who are not afraid to name what they see. Be that person. Build that room. Refuse the strings. And understand this deeply. The fact that you chose to explore this topic, that you sat with these uncomfortable truths, that you asked hard questions of yourself, this is not a sign of weakness. It is the first act of sovereignty. Machiavelli wrote the Discourses not for the prince. He wrote them for the people. He wrote them for you. Let's bring it home. Today you learned about Machiavellianism, one of the most potent and psychologically complex personality traits in human nature. You traveled with me through the streets of Renaissance Florence, into the Senate chambers of ancient Rome, through the research of modern psychologists, and most importantly, through the chambers of your own mind. You now know the 6 tools of the puppet master: information control, strategic empathy, long game thinking, coalition building, the favor economy, and controlled vulnerability. You now know the 7 defenses: awareness, information diversity, direct naming, slowing the favor economy, protecting your vulnerabilities, building lateral connections, and knowing your own values with crystalline clarity. And you now know Machiavelli's deepest secret. He was not teaching people to be puppet masters. He was teaching people to recognize them, because a free, aware, and engaged people are the only force that can keep the puppet masters of the world in check. The strings are real. The game is real. But so is your power to see it, name it, and step beyond it. If this video moved you, challenged you, or gave you something you needed to hear, share it with someone who needs it too. Because the antidote to manipulation is always more awareness, more connection, more honest conversation. Leave a comment below. Have you encountered a puppet master in your life? What did they look like? What did you learn? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Subscribe if you believe that understanding human psychology, even the darkest corners of it, is one of the most important things a person can do for themselves and for the people they love. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, know the game, choose your moves, and cut the strings.